right, let's get to this form, because I know that's why everyone's here. Let's get some of the ground rules. Let's get started for each candidate. Each candidate is going to be given 2 minutes for an opening statement and 1 minute for a closing statement. The candidates did not receive any of these questions in advance. The co-sponsors have prepared questions that will be asked, but we will also be taking questions from the audience, and those will certainly be given priority. There are 3x5 cards available, and volunteers will be collecting them. Please print clearly, and we ask that they not be of a personal nature, so we don't want to know what their favorite food is or what genre of movies they like. So keep it really professional, and also if you can write as legibly as possible as well, because I know sometimes I've got chicken scratch. So for me to decipher, this was really a great example. We've already gotten one question, so yeah, keep that as legible as you possibly can, just so I can read those cards. The candidates will be asked the same questions. They've got 90 seconds to answer unless I indicate otherwise. The candidates will alternate who goes first on the questions. Everybody's going to get the same amount of questions, and everybody's going to get the same opportunity to answer them, so there'll be no substitution, or one person's not going to answer more than the other. In lieu of rebuttals, each candidate has been given these 2 yellow challenge cards. At the conclusion of any question after both answers have been given, a candidate may use his challenge card to take issue on something that the other candidate has said. The challenging candidate will also have another 45 seconds to rebut that rebuttal, so everybody will certainly be given equal opportunity. Time limits will be strictly enforced. There's my timekeeper right there, Kay. She's got her stop sign. So as 15 seconds approach, she's going to throw up the sign, and then once she throws up that stop sign, we ask you guys to stop. You don't have to stop right away, finish your thought, but don't elaborate so much that it just keeps going and going and going. You guys know the deal. The only thing that we ask is that you turn off your cell phones and be respectful, and if you have to take a call, please take it outside. But with that being said, we're going to get the opening statements. We decided, they genuinely decided we didn't do the coin toss, but the Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, will start with the opening statements, and his challenger, Joshua Trumbull, will have the next statement.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for being here, to the League of Women Voters, and to Latino Coalition for hosting this. It's really our sort of first and only forum of this way that we've had during the campaign, so Josh and I both really appreciate it. I'm a 4th generation Washingtonian. My family's been in the state since the 19th century. So Colleen and I have young kids, Jack and Katie, and they're 5th generation Washingtonians. So it's been an honor to serve as Attorney General for the past nearly 4 years. In being the Attorney General, the most important quality I think people want and expect in an Attorney General is independence. We're the law firm for you, we're the law firm for the state of Washington. That means all of our decisions need to be made in that independent fashion. It does not matter whether I support a law. What matters is we enforce law as it's written by the legislature or by the people through the initiative process. Number 2, a key part about being Attorney General is to take on powerful interests that do not play by the rules. Most Washingtonians, they can't hire their own high-priced attorney to take on a powerful interest that doesn't play by the rules. The Office of Attorney General is the people's law firm. We're there for the people to take on consumer protection cases or antitrust cases, those powerful interests. And time again, in the last 3.5 years, I hope we have a chance to talk about it, we have sued those interests. Comcast, Johnson & Johnson, the largest campaign finance case in state history, the Grocery Manufacturers Association. We're taking on cases like that, and we're winning. Third and last thing I'll say for the introduction is I've been proud to start new initiatives in the office as well. And one of those that's important to me is we created a civil rights unit in the office of the Attorney General. The last 50 years, if you call the AG's office with a civil rights complaint, we refer you somewhere else. Even though we have nearly 600 attorneys in our office, we've now created a civil rights unit that can take on those cases all around the state. We've had tremendous success. So again, I appreciate the sponsors and all of you being here and look forward to additional questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Trumbull.
Thank you. My name is Josh Trumbull. I live over in Lake Stevens, Washington. I have a small law practice currently that I help members of our community who are being harmed by unfair deceptive acts and fraud that is rampant, seemingly, among big business. And it's not just individual consumers, it's small business owners, it's all of us, it hurts our kids. I have a passion for this because I grew up in Snohomish, My dad owns a small business, my grandma owns a small business, and so I see what happens when big business interests, or really any other large interest, essentially buys their way around different laws, or they just get too big for individual members of the community to stand up for themselves against. And over the last 4 years, I have not seen the Attorney General's office do really anything, in my opinion, to protect our communities from the levels of fraud that's rampant right now in the financial industry. That everybody knows about the real estate bust and the foreclosure crisis, and currently Wells Fargo has been opening accounts for individuals that they didn't know about, and the entity that has the power to protect all of us from that, including our children, is the Attorney General's office, and that's why I'm running, because that's where the office needs to focus. It can use its resources to protect everyone, rather than trying to pick and choose different issues that should be enforced.
Thank you. We will now move on to the question and answer portion of the program, and we will begin with Mr. Ferguson. As I mentioned, the audience questions will take priority. We'll start with the audience question. Mr. Ferguson, you were asked to review Franklin County Prosecutor Sand's decision in the Zambrano Montes case. You agreed with the decision, but in your letter to the governor, you indicated how upset you were with what happened. You also implied that there were other options the officers could have used. Now here's the question that's being posed. What are those options, and is this the role of the Attorney General to make these statements without more detail? What makes you an expert in police procedure? You had a year to review this. The officers had a couple of seconds. Did they have time to decide as thoroughly as you did?
Sure. So there's a lot in that question. I'll do my best in 90 seconds. So yes, in reviewing that under state law, I was asked to review by the governor what transpired, and came to the conclusion that under our current state law and the criteria, the standard set, that the charges were not appropriate. I spent a year. There seems to be a criticism of the fact I took a year on that issue somehow.
I took a year because in my time as Attorney General, I don't think I had any more important decision to make in my time than what was the right decision for that particular case. So I went through and read every page of transcripts in that case. I viewed every single video, in most cases many, many times, met on multiple occasions with my team, and gave it the deliberation and thought that I think such a serious incident deserved. I took the time to write a letter to the governor. More than just issuing a press statement, I wanted to express concerns I had about that, and that I believe there were options. The good news is in Washington State, I think there are additional and proactive trainings for law enforcement related to critical incidents. I think Washington State has been a leader on that, and I would like to see additional funding to get those trainings for all law enforcement. So, hey, I want to apologize for taking a year to come up with a thoughtful decision on that. It was a challenging decision. I don't think I had a more challenging decision in my time as Attorney General, or frankly in my public life, but I felt for all those involved it merited that level of consideration. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull.
Sure. Just to be clear, I think that the statute we're talking about is RCW 9A 16040, and the reason why the county prosecutor, the federal prosecutor, and Washington Attorney General didn't charge anybody in that is that Washington has the standard is actual malice, and I certainly don't think that there's police officers out there doing their jobs with actual malice in their heart towards community members. However, that is a very high standard to be able to charge somebody under, and the statute actually allows, if I've studied it, it allows for the local community and the local police departments to actually implement standards that can be more protective. So there's a large debate going on right now about what to do with the actual malice standard, and then also the good faith belief. It certainly seems to me that if the good faith belief issue is discussed and amongst the police departments and the community, that would be enough to be able to protect officers when they're out in the field, and to have their legitimate use of deadly force used. Anytime you're going to be taking a human life, it should be a last option, and as a community, we need to believe that that's the case.
Thank you.
Now, the Attorney General decided not to file criminal charges against 3 Pasco police officers who shot Antonio Zombrano Montez on February 15th of 2015, citing the statute that you had just mentioned, and the malice clause was at such a high standard. Now, if you're elected, Mr. Trumbull, would you urge the legislature to revisit this standard and specifically to consider elimination of the need to prove that police officers acted with malice?
Well, to the extent that the Attorney General can urge things, I view it as more of a nonpartisan office. But I don't believe that Washington should have an actual malice standard in place. I don't believe there's any other state that has that standard. And I believe that the good faith standard is enough to protect police officers. When there's videos and things like that, a jury or the community, most people aren't looking to try to get police officers in trouble. And so I think that the good faith standard will be enough to insulate police officers' decisions, like you said, when they're made in the field instantaneously. So I think that the actual malice standard should be removed.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson.
Yeah, and I've been on record as agreeing with that, that the actual malice standard should be reviewed, or should be eliminated, excuse me. There is a group reviewing the standard right now, and they'll be making recommendations to the legislature. I was actually on a phone call earlier today with my staff about what position we may be taking on this standard. So I think my view has been expressed as eliminating the actual malice standard, and Josh is right. We're the only state that has that. That's logical to me. That makes sense. Whether and what additional changes to that standard are appropriate, I think, is frankly the more challenging part of the conversation, and one that the legislature ultimately be wrestling with. I do think Josh has indicated some reluctance that the AG should weigh in on this. Hey, I think it's precisely an issue like this where the people expect the Attorney General to weigh in on something as important as this standard. I did not weigh in on the standard while I was reviewing this particular case for obvious reasons. I did not think I should have expressed an opinion about the standard that I was actually applying a matter to. But now that case has been closed, we'll be putting together some additional thoughts for the legislature, as they will undoubtedly be grappling with this in the upcoming session.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson, you have said you will introduce legislation in the next legislative session to ban assault rifles such as the AR-15 and magazines with more than 10 rounds. Could you explain your reasons for proposing this, and are you optimistic about it passing? And Mr. Trumbull, when we get to you, do you support or oppose this proposed legislation if it comes to fruition?
Thanks. So yeah, it's proposing the ban on the sale of assault weapons. So if someone currently owns an AR-15, for example, they are grandfathered in. But it would ban the future sale of assault weapons, and importantly, as you mentioned, limits high-capacity magazines to 10 rounds. Right now in Washington State, there are no limits to high-capacity magazines. So, for example, at the Burlington shooting, where a number of folks lost their lives, the individual, I believe, had a 25 caliber magazine. The shooting, of course, in Mukilteo was with an AR-15. So in both of those cases, this law, if passed, would have applied in those situations. A number of states have passed these proposals, and I think it's possible that can pass in Washington State. Is it uphill? Of course. I've been clear about that. But in terms of why I'm proposing it, as the Attorney General, public safety is paramount from my standpoint, and we see these mass shootings literally happening every day around our country. That's not an exaggeration. Mass shootings are happening every day around our country, and they're happening here in our state as well. And I would encourage folks who have concerns about the proposal, take the time to meet with someone, a family member, as I have, of someone who's been shot at one of those mass shootings. And I think it's appropriate to take appropriate steps on that, respecting Second Amendment rights, but adopting proposals that are constitutional and have been upheld in multiple federal courts of appeals, as this type of proposal has been.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull.
Yes, I oppose the proposed ban. I've never seen, I don't believe that it exists in writing. I have no idea how assault rifle is defined. A magazine limit of 10 magazines, it seems pretty arbitrary. I've done a little bit of research, and whether you have a magazine size of 10 or 30, most people can shoot the same number of rounds in the same amount of time. I believe that government was formed to protect individual rights. There's the Second Amendment to the federal Constitution, but there's also in the Washington Constitution, it's Article 1, Section 24, and that also provides an individual right to bear arms. And so I think that the way to handle this issue is to figure out what the people who wrote the Washington Constitution and the federal Constitution meant, and what their intention was. I think that's what the law should be. If we want to change it, we should not do it through legislation. We should do it through a constitutional amendment. There's been numerous amendments to the Washington Constitution over just the last 50 years. I've heard that it's not okay to walk into a movie theater and yell fire with your First Amendment right. But what essentially this does is if somebody were to do that, it would ban the word fire from the English language, and I don't think that's appropriate.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull, you are running as a libertarian. How will being a libertarian influence how you would approach the job of Attorney General? And when we get to you, Mr. Attorney General, how does a Democrat affect your approach? Mr. Trumbull, we'll start with you.
Sure. So the reason why I ran as a libertarian is because I believe that it's the protection of individual rights that make our country great and make Washington great and make local communities great. And so one main job of the Attorney General's office is to obviously defend the state. And I think that it doesn't necessarily matter what your political leaning is to do that job. But the other job of the Attorney General's office is to protect our community. And in order for people to prosper and thrive, they have to be able to function in a community that's free from fraud and free from deception and free from insider information. And that's why that's the main thing that I would focus on, is I want to rid any industry, any business, anybody who's trying to harm consumers by deception, fraud, or insider information, that needs to not be acceptable in Washington. And once that happens, it will free all of you here tonight and all the people in our community to go out there and prosper.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question because it goes back to my comment at my introduction when the first thing I mentioned was the importance of independence in the Office of the Attorney General, something I emphasize with my team all the time. It does not matter what my political party is as Attorney General. The work that we do is to enforce and defend state law as adopted by the people or by the legislature. Whether I support that law or not, at essence, that is the work that we do. And so the partisan side of it should not and does not play a role from that standpoint. I think also I've demonstrated that. That's not just something I say. For example, we've filed lawsuits since I've been Attorney General against some of the biggest supporters of Democrats that run for statewide office, the Washington State Labor Council, the state trial lawyers, SEIU, Service Employees International Union. You'd be hard-pressed to find three bigger political supporters of mine than those three organizations, and yet I have filed lawsuits against all three of those entities since I've been Attorney General. We are equal opportunity in what we do, regardless of whether you are a political supporter or opponent. We treat folks equally. So I'm glad you asked the question because that is central to who we are as an office. That does not mean that folks always agree with my proposals or the direction I want to take the office in, but in the essence of the work that we do day to day, partisanship is definitely not a part of it, and rather doing the work of the people and defending and enforcing state law is.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson, recent press reports highlight the increased number of injured Latino agricultural workers at the workplace, including 46 farm workers who were subjected to pesticide spraying in a hop field near Toppenish this spring. Now, your office has spoken out on worker safety concerns at Hanford. In fact, there's a case in federal court today. If elected, what would you do to bring about the same level of concern and action on Latino agricultural worker safety and injuries?
Yeah, I have a strong interest in worker safety. That's represented by the Hanford workers case against the federal government and their contractors. From my standpoint, working with my team, happy to chat about that with folks about that issue specifically and see what my office can do. We have taken steps, for example, outside the issue of worker safety, but for farm workers, for example, who are not being paid what they earned working as farm workers in Washington State, I filed a brief with the state Supreme Court, something called an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, in support of the farm workers, and we prevailed before the Supreme Court. So I have an interest in supporting all folks in our community. And when it comes to worker safety, that is something we take seriously, and we have a role in making sure there's a safe work environment for all folks in our state.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull.
Sure. When people or companies or anybody that's in a position of power decide that they're going to use that power to hurt other people, that infuriates me. And it doesn't matter if you're a farm worker or a person shopping at the mall. That's not right. That's not what we need to have our community function in a proper way. like I've been saying, we need to have our community protected from these kinds of acts. And the way to do it is to make it more expensive to harm people and to break the law than it is to harm people and break the law. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to just sit there and look at just blanket numbers, and you decide, hey, we can break the law and make $1 million, or we can, and if we get caught, we'll get fined a little bit, but the odds of getting caught aren't very much. So you make the decision to break the law and make the $1 million. We need to make it so that equation is, if I get caught, it's going to be way more expensive than if I get caught breaking the law. It's going to be expensive, and it's not something that I would want to do as a business owner or as a person if I'm for some reason lacking the integrity to treat people with honesty and respect.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull, Washington State wants a federal judge to issue an injunction requiring the U.S. Department of Energy and its contractors to take steps to protect workers at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. In fact, it's in court today in Spokane. From January through July, Hanford workers have reported suspicious smells or symptoms that indicate exposure to chemical vapors. More than 50 workers have been exposed to toxic vapors. And according to your opponent, he says the culture of indifference to worker safety must end. Now, the DOE has said that the plaintiffs in this case have not shown any harm to the workers there. They're arguing that the symptoms like headaches are common. They don't necessarily indicate exposures to vapors. Now, in your opinion, what needs to be done to hold the DOE and its contractors more accountable for protecting workers out there?
Sure. So I think that the way that you hold the DOE accountable, they quit enriching nuclear materials out there, I think, in 1987, and it's just basically been sitting there festering. And then they rely on the people of Washington to go up there and remove it, and they don't protect their health. And I think that in this case, the Attorney General's office, it's the people's office, that's what needs to happen. You take the federal government to court, you show that it is harming people, you show that when fumes and radiation leak out of the ground, people's headaches and health effects aren't just a bad case of the flu. It's because of they're being exposed to this stuff that is a known toxin, and it kills people. And so the way to do it is that you, as an attorney general, you stay on that case and you keep it moving forward, and you keep getting orders out of the court that direct the federal government to take action that will protect us.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson.
Yes, so I filed that lawsuit for many reasons, but in part because over the last 20 years, hundreds of workers have gotten sick. We had about 50 or so this year, but hundreds before that. There have been 19 reports about worker safety at Hanford. Many of those reports have been commissioned by the federal government. The most recent report about 18 months ago, again, the federal government's own experts said, you've got a problem, federal government, with vapors being released, exposing workers, and workers getting sick. It's their own report. It's their own experts. I'm not making this up, right? It's coming from their own experts. The report says, here are the steps you should do. Again, the federal government's own experts. Here are the steps you should do to correct this problem. They don't do it. Even after I filed my lawsuit, they rolled back protections for workers, and that's when an additional 50 workers got sick. They're in court today, your government, the federal government, saying, I can't bring this lawsuit. The AG cannot, because not enough workers, not enough Washington workers have gotten sick. So therefore, I don't have jurisdiction. Part of their argument. So, look, do I think there's a culture of indifference to worker safety there? You bet. Do I say those words lightly? No, I do not. But I've read those reports. I do not take suing the federal government lightly, but I am not going to stand by while hundreds of workers, year after year, are exposed to these vapors and continue to get sick. It's not right. Frankly, it's shameful, and it does need to end.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson, Initiative 1491 would create an avenue to remove guns from people judged to be at high risk to harm themselves or others. It has support from a lot of people. However, the ACLU has expressed some big reservations about its implementation. Do you support this initiative? Why or why not?
I always like to answer questions, but I won't answer this one, and I'll tell you why. Since I've been Attorney General, I've never taken a position on an initiative. Not one. The reason is pretty straightforward. My job is to defend every initiative that's passed by the voters, of course. And number two is we actually write the ballot titles, sort of that 30, 35 words you see about every initiative when you go to vote, that's written by my office. So I'm mindful of the fact that if I come out against an initiative, for example, or for it, that folks might think quite reasonably that I may not be totally balanced or impartial when it comes to writing that language or in defending an initiative that I may or may not support. That does not mean I don't have my own personal views on these initiatives. So I'm happy to talk about any initiative in the past. So I'm sorry not to answer the question, but I have taken that position for that reason. I don't, for example, when we write those ballot titles, they are often, if not usually, challenged in court. There's a proceeding to challenge how we write those. Again, I don't want someone to challenge what we're writing because someone says, well, Ferguson doesn't support this, that's why he wrote it that way, right, to make it less persuasive. So again, I'm pretty out there on pretty much every issue. I'm not shy about expressing my views on things going on around the state, but I have tried to take that particular position when it comes to initiatives.
All right, thank you. Mr. Trumbull.
Sure. So I've read 1491. I'm not an expert on it, but my understanding of it is that the gun owner has the gun removed without any type of due process. There's no notice or opportunity to be heard before the gun is removed. I think that's a huge problem, and I think that all citizens deserve due process anytime there's going to be governmental action, and I would oppose it.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull, the U.S. Department of Justice has issued a report on community policing in Pasco, including 27 recommendations on increasing diversity in hiring, training, and community engagement as well. Assuming you agree with the federal findings, I'm not sure if you've seen it or not, what actions, if any, would you take to ensure that they comply with these recommendations in the city of Pasco?
So I have read the recommendations. I have no personal knowledge on why I would disagree with them. The community here would probably know better. My understanding of a federal order recommendation is that the federal government has jurisdiction over that. If jurisdiction was asked of the state, and specifically the Attorney General's office, then I think that it would be the duty of the Attorney General to advise their clients or advise the agencies of what the current law is. And I think that's the duty there, is that you give people that come to you as clients legal advice that lays out their options and their choices, and then they make the decisions. And something like this, I believe it's a community issue. I think that the community can have a really big impact on the way that its police force works, the way that its local government works. And so I would encourage, just as a citizen, I would encourage that the community to engage in communication with the police force and with the local government on how to resolve these issues.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson.
Yeah, that report is a thoughtful one, and those recommendations are positive. In the letter that I mentioned when I declined to prosecute the case we talked about earlier, in that letter I specifically mentioned those recommendations and said that I supported those recommendations in that report. So I think it's an excellent report and provides excellent guidance. I want to be clear, as Attorney General, I can't force a jurisdiction to adopt those. I mean, as Attorney General, I've got certain powers and certain things I don't have. I can't force that to happen. But as Attorney General, I can certainly express my views on issues like that. We work closely, as you might imagine, in my office with local law enforcement all around the state. When I'm in the Tri-Cities, I meet frequently with local law enforcement leaders, as you might imagine. So we work closely with them. I'll be doing, if I'm reelected, what I can to encourage law enforcement to take those recommendations seriously, which I'm sure they will, and to adopt them.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson, back to the subject of Antonio Zambrano Montes. The shooting of Antonio Zambrano Montes by Pasco police officers in February 2015 was investigated by a local special investigative unit made up of local law enforcement officers. And some in the community believe that the investigation was not credible because of some close working relationships between local police investigators and those being investigated. To avoid a possible conflict of interest among these police investigators, would you support inclusion of outside police investigators and possibly an outside prosecutor in police-involved deadly shootings across the state?
Well, I guess a couple thoughts about that. I mean, number one, I heard that criticism as well. And I think that's at least in part, I don't want to speak for Governor Inslee, but I think it's fair to say at least in part in response to that he asked my office to review the shooting. So my office has, without getting too technical about it, no original criminal jurisdiction. We cannot prosecute crimes on our own authority unless, in two circumstances, a local prosecutor asks us to take on a case because they have a conflict, for example, or don't have the resources to do it, or the governor can ask the attorney general to look at a case. That's what happened here. So there essentially is an avenue already. The governor at any time can ask the attorney general to look at any case. He has that authority, and that's what happened in this particular case. That's how I got the jurisdiction to do it. I didn't just decide to do it on my own. I was asked by the governor. That's how I had the authority to do it. So, so I think there is essentially a check in place now, if folks feel their voice was not heard, where the governor can ask the attorney general to come in and take a look at any particular shooting.
Thank you, Mr. Trumbull.
This issue is very, it's troubling, and I think that there are some easy solutions. Anytime we have government acting, we're generally going to have some people disagreeing with it, some people agreeing with it, and then some people not really knowing what's going on. And so the difficulty comes in when government is not open and transparent enough, because the people who are concerned about what's happening are going to automatically assume there's some sort of conspiracy or some sort of conflict of interest. And in my opinion, what the government should do, by the government, it's people that get elected. They need to be aware of what their job is and that they shouldn't be doing anything not in the full openness for the public to look at. And so something like this, when there's an appearance of a conflict of interest, even if there isn't a conflict of interest, I think that we need to keep in mind, have our leaders understand that, look, let's just say there is no conflict of interest, and you know that, and the other person knows that, but there could be the appearance of a conflict. And so I think that government officials should work to avoid even the appearance of a conflict. And that way, when things happen in the community, people can know that the process was fair and it was conducted in the open, and they can have faith in what happens in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull, prosecutions for driving with a suspended license consume a lot of time in the justice system and a lot of resources. A growing number of Washington residents lose or cannot regain their driving privileges because of unpaid traffic fines or other legal financial obligations. Under current law, a person with multiple unpaid tickets must go separately to each local court to pay these fines off in order to get their license back. Now, the question is, do you favor or oppose proposals for a statewide program so that persons needing to regain their license to work or retrain or just get back in the workforce can do so in a single unified process addressing all tickets that block their license?
Sure. I 100% agree with the idea that we need to get people their driver's licenses back. When I was in law school, I worked for the Spokane County prosecutor and district court, and I think you're referring to essentially driving with a suspended license in the third degree. And I mean, essentially what that is it's driving when you're too poor to pay your tickets so that you can go to work and you can earn money to buy food. And every time you get pulled over, it's an automatic, $550 no insurance fine, $550 no driver's license fine, and then plus whatever you got pulled over for. So every time you get pulled over, it's $1,500. And people get stuck into this scenario where they don't know what to do. They can't feed themselves if they don't drive, and so they just keep driving. And so when I was over there, one of the things that the county was doing, it was implementing a program to help people get their licenses back. Essentially, I don't know how it turned out, but it was kind of a mini version of this where all the fines and things like that would go into one central place. The people would agree to make a monthly payment on that, and they could have their license back. And then they can get to work, they can earn a living, they can contribute to the community, and it would free up massive amounts of district court dockets. Oftentimes there would be 100 people on a Thursday afternoon, and they were all there for driving with a suspended license in the third degree. So I would fully support something like that.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson.
Yeah, a great question, and this is another one that Josh and I agree on. What I'd add to that is I don't just support this. We are actually doing work on it right now. My office is leading a stakeholder group of folks all around the state looking at this very issue. Huge problem. And I'm glad you asked the question, or the audience member asked the question, because it's an issue that does not get, frankly, the attention that it should. And the challenges that, in many cases, the working poor are facing throughout our state. So that's why my office, again, is leading this group of folks from all over the state. What we're trying to do is put together a proposal that we can take to the state legislature to get changes in state law to create exactly what I think the question it gets to. Hey, can we have one system in place so folks can go one place to pay their bills and not be caught in this endless trap of multiple jurisdictions having fines collecting and they may not even be aware of it, and a lot of confusion that results from it, and frankly a lot of heartache that's unnecessary results as well. So I'm proud my office is taking a leadership role. We look forward to making a recommendation to the legislature, working with stakeholders from all around the state and trying to get a law passed with legislators. Whoever asked the question, if they have the interest, I'd encourage them to also work with their legislators and ask them about this and support the work that we're doing so we can get a law passed when the time comes.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson, your office recently sued Comcast for $100 million, charging unfair and deceptive ads and practices. I was reading last night they had some sort of $4.99 charge for wiring that was never being implemented. Do you think that we need more regulations for cable and broadband companies? Because as we all know, you get the bill and it can be quite confusing.
I think we need more enforcement, that's for sure. I'm the first Attorney General to file a lawsuit on this. It's a service protection plan. In case you have one, check it out. It's called a service protection plan, and where they essentially are billing $4.99 a month. I think since I brought the lawsuit, they actually increased the price of it to $5.99, by the way. And the suit, by the way, is for well over $100 million, by the way. So it's an example of our office taking on powerful interests that do not play by the rules. But do we need more enforcement? You bet. In order to do that, you need a legal team that's large enough to take on a huge case like Comcast. As you might imagine, they have a big legal team to represent them. That is their right, certainly. When I became Attorney General, we had 8 attorneys in our office who do consumer protection work and a legal professional staff to support them. We receive about 20,000 consumer complaints a year. I have invested back into that office, Consumer Protection Division, from recoveries we get from bad actors. So we now are in the process of hiring a few more folks. We'll have 22 attorneys here in the next month or two doing that work. We've increased from 8 to 22. As a result, we can file lawsuits against Comcast, Johnson & Johnson, very powerful interests with a lot of legal resources, with huge impacts on the people of the state of Washington, as well as do our day-to-day work on consumer protection for cases that, hey, are never going to be in the headlines, but matter to the consumer who was scammed or defrauded. So that's why, in part, I've grown that consumer protection division so much, is when we take on big cases like this, and I'd like to see more enforcement on these big cases as well.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull.
Thank you. Yeah, this issue is the exact reason why I drafted the Community Protection Act. It's a bill that brings the protection for people in Washington's community up to the same level that the federal laws provide people. Instead of having to rely on an overtaxed government or the Attorney General's office when they may or may not have the resources, it would allow individuals in our community to stand up and protect themselves and their neighbors. And so I think that giving people the ability to enforce the law is the way to go on this. People notice when they're getting harmed. They shouldn't have to have, like Bob was saying earlier, oh, well, not enough people were harmed for the Attorney General to do it. That's an argument that gets made in court. That's crazy. We should be able to have, if there's 20 people in a community, they should be able to protect themselves. And, when it comes to broadband and cable, it's difficult to see how we can have an open, fair market when you have one choice, when you have one line to your house. I think that's a huge problem. And I would like to see people be able to have different choices in which service they go with. And just those two things, enforcing the law, giving people the ability to protect themselves, and then giving people choice. I think that would make great strides in every area.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull, the state recently settled the Oso landslide settlement with residents of that area. What should the state take away from this settlement that might prevent future incidents of this nature?
Sure. Well, I think that there's two incidents relating to Oso. One is the landslide, and if you look back, there was a lot of evidence that different jurisdictions knew that hillside was unstable. They did not tell people that it was unstable, and in fact, they continued to issue building permits right in the potential slide's path. And so rather than actually telling people that this could happen, they were actually encouraging them to build in that spot. The second incident that we may be talking about is that fact that the state's experts, which were paid about $3.5 million, actually were destroying evidence so that they would not have to turn it over to the plaintiffs. And turns out that that was known by at least one attorney, and according to the judge's opinion, several attorneys on the case for about a year or a year and a half. That incident essentially ended up with the state having to pay approximately $1.2 million in sanctions that would not have had to been paid. And, the people sitting here tonight, myself, there is no such thing as the state paying that. That's going to come out of our pockets. And so those are two incidents that are highly concerning to me. And the way to fix those, again, is regarding the building permits and the information the state knew, have the government be open. Regarding evidence destruction and attorneys in the Attorney General's office not jumping up and down saying to stop, I think that you have to fix that with training and procedures in place in the office to let people know.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson.
Sure, I'll focus on the sanction side because Josh's criticism is a fair one, to be candid. There was an attorney in my office who was no longer with the office who was aware that the experts were deleting emails. To say that's not appropriate would be a wild understatement. And so once I became aware of this, the plaintiffs filed a motion about this when they became aware of it. And so at that point, I asked my chief deputy and my solicitor general, the top two attorneys in my office, to oversee how we were going to handle that and make sure we recovered as many of those emails as possible that were deleted by the experts. We hired a forensic expert. We brought in folks from all over our office to recover those emails from the experts and review them and provide them to the court over a long period of time. So I think the criticism is absolutely fair. It is worth noting that the judge, in his order that he issued the sanction, did write the following. He wrote, "The court takes this opportunity to note that the state's overall response to the court sanctions order has been honorable. While the parties can quibble about the completeness of the state's initial response, it is uncontested that the state cooperated with the court, stayed focused on the important issues, and directly answered the court's questions during this process." He goes on to talk about our response. Look, I take no pride in what happened. It was a failure, and that's an understatement. And I've communicated that to the entire office more than once already. But I am proud of our response. Once we became aware of it, I told my team, look, we're going to be as transparent as we can. We're going to cooperate with the court. We're going to provide those emails. We did that, and I think that's the first step in trying to correct this bad mistake.
All right, thank you. I'm going to have one more question here, then we're going to get to closing statements. Mr. Ferguson, we'll start with you. How would you rate the average citizen's consumer awareness, poor, fair, or good? And what is your office currently doing to improve this awareness of everything that your office has to offer?
I'm not sure. It's hard to put a grade on that, but I'll just give you some numbers. I think I mentioned earlier we receive 20,000 consumer complaints a year. That's a fair number, right? But do I think all Washingtonians have an equal sense of the fact that our office can be there to help them if they're facing a consumer complaint? No, I do not. So we've actually taken a number of steps to make sure that folks are aware. We are trying to proactively reach out to all communities throughout the state about the work that we do. We do press releases, for example, in multiple languages. We do interviews. We've been very active, for example, with Spanish-speaking radio stations to bring on myself, even though I do not speak Spanish, and those in my office who do, to talk about the consumer protection work we do and to let folks know about what kind of scams we see that are out there to give folks a warning about what's going on. We have worked with a number of organizations holding forums around the state to talk about scams, for example, that affect seniors disproportionately to the rest of our population. So we've taken that all around the state, essentially a roadshow. So we take every opportunity we can to get the word out. Now, that said, it is a challenge, right? And so any opportunity like this where I can talk about that folks can reach out to our office is important. Lastly, what I'll say on this is that when my consumer protection, I'll be brief on this, when my consumer protection team asks, hey, what kind of cases should we bring? I often say, hey, they're all important, but any case we can bring on behalf of individuals in our state, for example, who speak English as a second language or may not realize that the Office of Attorney General is there for him, are those of special interest to me.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull.
Sure. So I'm running because for the last 4 years, I've been trying to help people who are being taken advantage of by the financial industry, whether it's because of their servicer's negligence in applying a payment, or whether it's because they were advised to miss payments in order to get a loan modification, and that resulted in a foreclosure on their home. And you track that, and that affects their children, and that affects the way that the schools, and it's hurting our entire community. And what's happening is is that the people that I deal with, they have been reporting this type of thing to the Attorney General's office. They have not been seeing any action in order to protect us from this type of thing. And so essentially what happens is these people and our neighbors and our friends and our families, I would bet that everybody here knows somebody this has happened to. They may just not have told you about it because you feel ashamed and you feel embarrassed and you just kind of end up getting rolled over and thinking that there's nobody out there that can help you. And I've been trying to help people, and we need the state's Attorney General's office to address this issue. So, thank you.
Without a challenge card.
I didn't think we'd
I've got
get to
two
one.
of them. I'm going to use one of them.
All right.
So is that I'm allowed to still use it?
Yeah, hey, we're here at this final
Great.
question.
How much time do I have how much time do I have on the challenge?
It's actually, 45 seconds?
Perfect.
Yeah.
So Josh knows my answer on this. I mentioned we've increased the number of attorneys and support staff that do consumer protection work dramatically, almost tripled. Much of that work is going to issues related to foreclosures, which he knows. We're bringing more cases than we have in the past. And one additional point to make is, in cases we have brought, I've actually provided from recoveries $3 million to organizations that help provide legal counsel for individuals facing foreclosure. That's direct help for folks getting legal counsel for free from experts in the field, from grants provided from my office, from recoveries we've received from bad actors, investing it back in to those servicer folks facing a really, really difficult situation. More attorneys, more legal support, and more grants to the tune of millions of dollars to help folks get direct representation.
Thank you. And Mr. Trumbull is going to rebut your rebuttal.
Sure. So Mr. Ferguson's office has provided money. I don't believe it's for legal counsel. It's for housing counselors, for people who go through the financial, the FFA, Foreclosure Fairness Act mediations. Those mediations are simply one step to foreclosure. The servicer shows up, and they do everything they can to get it closed so they can foreclose on people's homes. I'm not criticizing the fact that the Attorney General's office has grown the Consumer Protection Division. I'm not criticizing the fact that the office is suing Comcast. What I'm saying that needs to happen is we need to address the biggest entity in the industry that's harming consumers, and that is the financial industry. I've personally been involved in cases where fraudulent documents were filed with the court. That type of thing happens more than we would like to see, and it's going to take the Attorney General's office to keep us safe from that type of stuff.
All right, thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, both, for your candid answers. We really appreciate it. It's now time for closing statements, and both candidates have 1 minute to convince you that they're the better candidate for Attorney General. Mr. Ferguson, you'll go first.
Great. Thanks again for participating. I really appreciate it. And for the first time in state history, no Republican filed for Attorney General. It's the first time a major party candidate did not run for Attorney General. And I like to think that's in part because folks know I run an independent, nonpartisan law office, treating folks who break the law the same, whether they're political supporters or opponents. That's what I'm glad Josh has run. I think this is our last time on a stage together. We've been at editorial boards around the state. I think it's important to have a challenge for everybody who runs for office, frankly, so we can have a conversation just like this, right? There are lots of things I propose doing that I understand some folks may not agree with, but you can only really have this conversation like this when you have someone who's running against you. So since it's our last time together, Josh, thanks for running. It's been I've really enjoyed spending some time with you the last few months.
Thank you. Mr. Trumbull.
Yeah, thank you for having us tonight. This was great for coming. If you want an Attorney General that's going to stand up to the largest industry in the world, that's financial industry, vote for me. I've put the community protection bill out there. It's public. You can read it, see what you think of it for yourself. I've continued to do this work. I've been doing it for 4 years, and we need to make sure that our community is safe because it's based on individuals and individuals being creative and working hard. And the only way that we can prosper and thrive, including teaching our children how to do it, is if we have a system that does not reward fraud or deception. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to thank both candidates for coming. I know Mr. Ferguson has to catch a flight, so we'll get him to the airport here. And thank you to everybody in the audience for being a part of it. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to get to our next candidates. Thanks, everybody.